Namaskar and welcome to StudyIQ. I am your friend Rahul. I'm quite sure looking at this statement, you have already deciphered that agenda for today's discussion is connected with international relations. A very famous line by Henry Kissinger, who said, America has no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, only interests. This maxim holds very true at the international level in international politics. We always say that there are no permanent foes or no permanent friends at global level. There are only national interests. And we also know that national interests tend to be quite dynamic. They change, they evolve with time. Now you're thinking, sir, I already know this. Why are we discussing this? We are going to understand this statement to a recent example by analyzing recent relationship between China and Australia. What we are looking at is a transition or a change in Sino-Australian relations in last 1 year or so. You can see here Sino-Australian thaw. It reveals some limitations of Beijing's economic coercion. So we'll understand how relations have evolved between China and Australia in the last decade or so. I'll put a dividing line somewhere at say 2015. Since 2015 till now, how things have changed. Yes, we are going to understand a little bit about this even from the earlier times, because from the beginning of 21st century, relationships, especially the economic relationship between Australia and China, have been quite positive. But since 2015, 2016, we saw a downward trend. And it's not just because of the ruling party, but there are many other factors at play. Through this analysis of Sino-Australian relationship at the end of the discussion, we'll also talk about what lesson does it hold for us? What lessons can we take from this development? All right, this is going to be the agenda. To get to know all these things, stay with me till the very end. All right, let's begin. But before that, a small notice to all the UPSC civil services aspirants. StudyIQ's P2I program, batch 2, its admission is closing out at the end of the month, 31st October. You do know this is the most comprehensive program for UPSC civil services preparation, where we will be hand-holding you through prelims, through mains, through interview, all the 3 stages. You have multiple validities and multiple formats to choose from. Just visit our website, enroll before 31st. I'll see you in the class. All right, let's begin. As I told you, we are going to discuss about the Sino-Australian relationship, especially from recent times, because we know that the Australian and Chinese relationship were mostly on the downward trend, especially since 2015, 2016. But somehow in last year or so, from 2022, we are looking at a thaw between these two countries and a possible rapprochement between these two countries, especially in terms of economic relations. So we are going to understand this transition. Now, when we look at China's relationship with any country for that matter, now you will see a very similar kind of graph, especially since 1980s. With Australia, you will see that the relationship has transformed since the 21st century. The trade, here I am only talking about Australian exports, but if you look at any bilateral trade for China with any other country, you will see a similar kind of trend. Since 1980s, there is an increasing business or increasing economic relationship with that country, especially more and more Chinese exports to that country. But with Australia, there is a small exception. Australia also increased their trade tremendously with the Chinese, especially since 2000, since year 2000. If we look for the next 15 years, you will always see an upward trend. Let me focus on this particular area. You can see that the graph grows exponentially. In the 15 years, Chinese and the Australian trade, it grew tremendously. The liberal parties were ruling. I can talk about different prime ministers who were ruling at this time. Talk about Kevin Rudd, talk about Julia Gillard, talk about Tony Abbott. So economic ties with Chinese were enhanced more and more. And that's why we see an upward trend. And then comes a turn back in 2015 or 2016. Now, when I zoom in at this particular period, since 2014-15, that's why I told you we are going to discuss the Sino-Australian relationship from 2015 till 2023. Now, if you look at this particular period in terms of trade, the Australian exports to China have been more or less stagnant. If you look at this particular area, why? This was a period where there was tension between Australia and the Chinese relationship. There were so many things which came up. Australia raised many issues where China was conducting espionage, China was trying to put their people in Australian parliament, etc. So different kinds of developments took place. We'll talk about that in some time. But what I want to address here is that since 2015, there has been a downward trend or somewhat stagnant economic relationship. But if you look at the recent trend, 2022-23, there is a slow and steady rise back. Now, let's take 2015-16 as a dividing line. Let's try to understand what exactly happened. Now, in 2016, it was Malcolm Turnbull, and later on, Scott Morrison became the Prime Minister in Australia. Now, during this time, the Australians, they took a stance which was more or less anti-China. In 2016, it was Australia, one of the important littoral states in the Pacific. They highlighted that China has no claim in the South China Sea, which was a very, very big deal for a country like Australia. So a first step from Australian side. Of course, there are many retaliations which come from the Chinese side also. We'll talk about them. But if we look at year-on-year analysis, the relationship between the two countries, China and Australia, they continuously soured. The very next year, in 2017, Australia's Four Corners investigation, it revealed that the Chinese were spying through the Australian universities. Later on, at the behest of Australia, we can say that Quad was rejuvenated. Yes, the idea of Quad, it began way back in 2007 itself, although it was conceptualized in 2004 during the tsunami, yes, or after the tsunami, I would say. But the idea came up in 2007, and after that, Australia did not show too much of interest in developing the Quadrilateral Forum. However, now in 2017, Australia took up the lead, and finally, the Quadrilateral Forum evolved. India, Japan, USA, and Australia Forum, it evolved. And many policy experts, they do highlight that yes, Quad is a multilateral forum. Yes, there are many areas of cooperation, but there is an anti-China flavor for sure. If you look at all the other countries, US has interest to contain the Chinese, India and China. We know that there is a boundary dispute. Japan and China also have a boundary dispute. Apart from that, if you look at the developments, Australia investigated that there was a Chinese plot to install a spy member of parliament in Australian parliament itself. These were some of the lowest points in Australia and China relationship. And Australia was one of the first countries in 2018 itself which had banned Huawei and ZTE in their 5G telecom structure. In fact, when this happened, many countries had criticized Australia that they have taken a very strong step, a very radical step, where they have banned the Chinese companies from 5G equipment. But later on, many other countries followed the suit. Many other countries from Europe, even India, has taken this suit. We have not given the trusted geography or trusted company tag to both Huawei and ZTE. Apart from that, Australia was one of the first countries who continuously called for a comprehensive investigation into the origins of COVID-19, clearly pointing towards the Chinese involvement, or clearly trying to investigate or trying to highlight that there is some sort of an issue from the Chinese side with respect to COVID. Now, during this time, what the Chinese did. Chinese in 2020 itself, they gave up a long list. It was 14 grievance list where they highlighted that Australia is siding with the United States of America and it is running an anti-China campaign. What Australia is doing is they are funding anti-China think tanks. There is now foreign interference legislation which was brought. As I told you, they investigated that China is trying to put an MP in the parliament. So foreign interference legislation was brought, which was targeted towards the Chinese. China alleged that. Chinese investment was rejected by Australia continuously in their agriculture, and allied activities. Chinese investment was stopped. More than 10 Chinese investment projects since 2018 were rejected. Apart from that, banning of 5G, continuously highlighting the Chinese excesses in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, and the relationship with the Chinese. China highlighted all these things. Yes, China gave a grievance list. Apart from that, China also took many steps. Now, you do understand, China always uses the idea of economic coercion, isn't it? It's very strange. As I showed you in one of the first clips, we are talking about the relationship from 2015. Now, if we look at this particular graph here, in 2015, we need to observe one more thing. Why I took 2015 as a date? Because in 2015, one would expect that the relationship or the economic relations would trend upward. Why? Because this was the time period when the FTA, the free trade agreement, was signed between China and Australia, and everybody expected that trade relations would grow, but that did not happen. The trade relations mostly remained stagnant because now the relationship, it turned sour, and by 2020 we all know what happened. The big point, it came up later on in 2021 as well. One of the lowest point in the Sino-Australian relationship was a tweet which was made by Li Juanzhao, who is the spokesperson from China. He tweeted an image, I would say, which was created by an AI, or I would say digitally created image, where Australian soldier is slaughtering a child. He's indicating that Australia is slaughtering Afghan children. The Australian government, it sought apology from the Chinese government over this. But the lowest point, I would say, it came through the AUKUS deal. What happened with China? Probably they did not anticipate that Australia would go for such a strong response. Yes, they imposed so many tariffs on Australian products. Australian wine was more or less banned, very high tariffs. Australian wool was banned into China. But the AUKUS deal where US and UK agreed on sending nuclear powered submarines to Australian coast. Apart from that, during this time, Japanese F-35s were also allowed patrolling, or allowed over the Australian coast, I would say. And then Australia also joined the chorus. In 2021, they did not send any diplomats to Beijing for Winter Olympics. So this all shows to some of the worst pointers between the relationship between China and Australia, isn't it? But things started to change. When we look at the change from 2020, slowly and steadily, there is now an improvement between the relationship of two countries. One can attribute this to change in government. Yes, earlier it was Malcolm Turnbull, later on Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison was quite scathing, or his words were quite scathing towards the Chinese. But since Labour Party came into rule, Anthony Albanese, there is a slow and steady thawing of relationship between the two countries. In fact, Anthony Albanese, the incumbent Prime Minister of Australia, he has served as Deputy Minister with previous Prime Minister. He has served under the Kevin Rudd administration. He has served under the Julia Gillard administration. So it was quite expected. And very soon, what we are looking at is Australia's exports. Currently, in 2023, they are running high again because the tariff barriers are slowly and steadily easing out. Apart from that, Australia gave a statement that they want a normalized trade relationship with China. And now a dialogue was held a few months back. Of course, the back channel diplomacy was going. For the first time in 3 years, a high-level dialogue took place between China and Australia. And now the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is going to visit China in first week of November. And ahead of this visit, in just 1 week, I would say next week itself, in the first week of November, he would be meeting his counterpart Xi Jinping. And ahead of this meeting, a lot of bonhomie is going on. Australia has suspended its WTO wine tariff dispute. As I told you, the Chinese had imposed heavy tariff barriers, and there is a free trade agreement finalized in 2015. Despite that, they imposed heavy tariff barriers on wine, on wool, and many other products. And now the WTO complaint, it has been withheld. Apart from that, from the Australian side, the announcement has come that they are not going to oppose Chinese entry into CPTPP, the Comprehensive Partnership, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So Australia said, we are not going to oppose it. Apart from that, some other things have come. In the second week of October itself, Australia has decided that they are not going to cancel Chinese companies' lease. That means a Chinese company has been given a lease to operate in the Darwin Port, the northernmost port in Australia, the Darwin Port. There, the Chinese company would have presence. And from Chinese side also steps have come. It's not just Australia, but Chinese side has also released Australian reporter Cheng Lei. She was released after 3 years of arrest for espionage. So steps are being taken. Now you must be thinking, sir, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Yes, one of the reasons I told you, yes, there is a change in government from Scott Morrison to Anthony Albanese, which was quite expected. But this is also a testimony to rise of Australia, I would say. See, for a very long time, Australia was not considered a major player in geopolitics. Very similar to, I can compare with India, very similar to India for that matter. Especially owing to its geography, Australia and New Zealand being a little separate, and they mostly towed the line with United States of America. But what we have seen in the last decade or so, Australia's rise, and China has understood that. China basically tried to bully Australia. Australia stood the ground, and now things are slowly and steadily improving. Apart from that, yes, we can add a few more factors, especially the geopolitical development that is taking place, the Russia-Ukraine war and the current Israel-Gaza conflict. The focus and attention is completely on that. So slowly and steadily things are improving on the other side. So it's advantage Russia and advantage China to a large extent because the focus is on something else now. Apart from that, one of the biggest factor for this improvement in relationship is the economic pragmatism. Especially Chinese dependence on these three things: iron ore, LNG, liquefied natural gas, and lithium. Now, if you look at exports from Australia, that means things Australia sends to the Chinese. If you look at this, Australia's liquefied natural gas supply is highest to the Chinese. So China relies on them for LNG supplies. China, which is one of the, I would say, infrastructural giants itself, they rely on iron ore imports. So Australia exports heavy amount of iron ore to the Chinese. And during this problematic phase of relationship, the exports, yes, they stood more or less stagnant, but China understood that we rely on Australia, and we are talking about more and more need of lithium. Now, when you look at lithium raw material supply, where does it come from? This is the scenario for entire world. And let me highlight who is this yellow color. Australia, yellow, Australian cricket team, yellow dress, right? So 46% of the world's lithium raw material supply, it comes from Australia. And perhaps Chinese have understood this. And there is slowly and steadily an improvement in relationship. I am not telling that there is strategic alignment among the two. Yes, trade relations have been improving, but Australia, it mostly toes the same Western line when it comes at the major issues or at the global level. Nonetheless, what we can see is slowly and steadily China understanding the importance of Western countries because they rely on these countries, especially Australia. And there is a big lesson for us. What is happening between the Sino-Australian relations, especially in last year or two, it is a template for all the other countries who want to have decent relationship with China and how to balance the superpower competition or great power competition for that matter, USA was the Chinese. For last few years, we have seen tariffs, counter tariffs, sour relationship between Australia and China. Australia, they could not find alternatives for their iron ore, for their LNG, for their wool, for their wine. So they had to rely on China. And Chinese also found that they are substantially reliant on Australia, especially for these goods. So it's a quid pro quo kind of relationship. And this is a big lesson for India. What we can take out of this, of course, now you can counter me suggesting that sir, India and China have a border dispute. That's a separate thing. Yes, we have a border dispute, but we also have a trade relationship of more than a bilateral trade of more than $100 billion. The same applies for Australia as well. The bilateral trade between them would be approximately, I would say, $180 to $190 billion, and it is trade surplus towards the Australian side. That means China is more and more reliant on Australia, and it is because of this we see relationship transiting slowly and steadily towards improvement. And this is perhaps a lesson for India as well. Right now, when we look at India-China trade relations, yes, we have border dispute. Let's keep that separate, but we have economic relations, isn't it? And that relationship runs hugely in deficit. That means we import more and more from China and we export less and less towards the Chinese. The things should turn other way around. Then we can expect betterment in relationship possibly. That's the template. But I hope you do understand how things have changed, isn't it? What Henry Kissinger said, America has no permanent friend, no permanent enemies. This applies to all. We can say China has no permanent friends, China has no permanent enemies. What they have is interest. And what interest? They are predominantly towards economic interest. China, at one point of time, was considered the manufacturing capital or manufacturing hub of the world. Even today, yes, they might hold that title. But what we have seen from 2020 is a decoupling which is taking place. Slowly and steadily, economies are trying to decouple from them. Australia tried it. China also tried tried for some alternatives, but they couldn't find. And what we see is again reliance of each other, reliance of Australia and China on respectively, I would say. Right? That's the basic idea. And that's the big lesson for us, that we need to gradually reduce the deficit and probably move towards surplus. Then it would be a better situation for India as well. I hope you have understood what is happening, how things are evolving. As I told you, national interests, they also tend to be very dynamic. They change, they evolve. And it also depends on the party in power, yes, but not to a large extent. Not to a large extent. But since coming of Anthony Albanese, we are looking at a better relationship because of the especially ideology, the Labour Party and ideology there. So let's see what happens. We'll be keeping an eye on his visit to Beijing, which is in November first week. Whenever some new development comes, new news comes, we will have a discussion on Study IQ for sure. Thank you for watching this video. Jai Hind.